In the southern suburbs of Beirut, thousands of supporters of Lebanon's Hezbollah gathered to bury one of their own. He was Jihad Mughniya, the 26-year-old son of Hezbollah's late military leader. Hezbollah says he died along with 5 other Hezbollah figures when an Israeli helicopter attacked their convoy in Syria near the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights.
The stakes have been raised once again between Israel and Hezbollah. The United Nations is urging maximum restraint to avoid further escalation. Deaf ears as missiles fly between Israel and Lebanon. Welcome to MidPoint. Senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, career Army officer, and expert in counterterrorism and homeland security, Richard Brennan joins us. Rick, pleasure to see you again.
Nice to be here, Ed.
When we look at what's happened now, as Israel is being hit by artillery attacks, in your opinion, perhaps in the opinion of those who follow such things in the Middle East, how close are we now to the point where Israel finally says to itself, that's it, we've had it, it is time to go on the offensive and launch a full-scale war?
Well, I think Israel will use a lot of restraint in terms of what they're trying to do. They understand that the United States is behind them. They're concerned about where the administration is right now. But I think in the end, they're going to try to figure out a way that they can manage this in the short term to make certain that it doesn't blow up in the long run. And clearly the big issue on their plate right now isn't Hezbollah, although they're watching it. The big issue is the Iranian nuclear issue.
How do they manage this, though, Rick? Because this is the big question. We've been talking about this, and it's fair to say that on any given day of any given week, we can start a show with this and talk about missiles flying in Israel. So when you talk to the average person, they'll say, manage this? That would seem to be completely impossible.
Manage it for the Israelis to make certain that they can limit the amount of damage that's done to the civilian populace. And as you know, the Iron Dome, which the United States has helped Israel develop, has provided a great deal of security for them, but they're still very vulnerable. The issue of Hezbollah, what Iran's doing throughout the region, is of extreme concern. And so managing it for the Israelis is really trying to make certain that you can limit the amount of casualties that you have to Israeli citizens and to foreign tourists.
I'll play devil's advocate then, going after Hezbollah, because at this point, when you look at what Iran may bring to Israel, Hezbollah is almost a bit of a nuisance. And I don't mean to downgrade what they're doing, but I'm talking about the nuclear possibility of an Iranian state at this point. So with regard to Hezbollah, wouldn't it almost be in their best interests to go after them? Do what you can. Wipe them clean as much as you can. Although, wait a minute, I'll stop myself and say, is that also part of a problem because you put your forces over here, then Iran is watching and they see that you're weakened on another front? Boy, there's a lot in this.
Well, there's a lot in it. And when you're looking at there's really no way of winning, defeating Hezbollah by the Israelis moving forward. That would be a long, drawn-out war for the Israelis, and it's something that they don't want to get engaged in that type of conflict with Hezbollah. They'd rather go ahead and try to manage the problem and deal on the international level with the nuclear issue, which you're exactly right. That's a big issue for them. Iran has claimed that they want to destroy the little Satan, just as they want to destroy the United States, the great Satan. But Iran in possession of a nuclear weapon, it would be extremely deadly and destabilizing for the entire region.
How much of what Israel does now is being run by the Obama administration seemingly being completely paralyzed in doing anything with Iran in negotiations now?
I think a lot. I think this administration, and to be fair, the Bush administration also, were all paralyzed by the Iranian nuclear issue. Every policy that we've tried to develop against Iran or Iranian-sponsored militants, whether it be Hezbollah or the number of Iraqi militias, the Houthis in Yemen, all of those policies and how we respond to them have been held hostage to the nuclear issue. And we have got to make certain that the Iranians don't acquire nuclear weapons. And it's very, very likely the direction that we're going and the dragging on of the deliberations that we're going to end up with having Iran with a breakout capacity within several months. We may stop them temporarily, but it'll be on the fringe. And this is something that at a certain point, Israel is going to have to look at and determine whether or not they try to do something on their own, although that would be very difficult to do.
15 seconds. Do you believe that Benjamin Netanyahu has everybody behind him in Israel, or is that still something of a fractured leadership now?
Well, it's always a fractured leadership, but I think he's got the majority of Israelis behind him, and they understand what the threat is to their security.
They decide what the threat is. They also know what the threat is here when it comes to looking at those who still want to exterminate the Jewish state. Rick, please hold on for a couple of minutes. Other side of the break, the State Department, our State Department, meeting with the Muslim Brotherhood, and another nation caves to the demands of ISIS. In many eyes, this sets a terrible precedent. Some would say it is all about saving lives, and every life is important. What's the reality? That's what we get to every day. This is MidPoint, where we question everything. Back to work right now with senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, Rick Brennan joins us. Rick, let's turn to some other issues here. Jordan has agreed to a prisoner swap with ISIS that could free the pilot, the Japanese journalist, and already you hear the immediate reaction. Bad idea to deal with terrorists, but then other people come back and say, wait a minute, if you have the opportunity just for a prisoner swap, it makes sense at that point. You're saving a life and you're not losing much. What do you think?
It's always a bad idea to deal with terrorists, even for a prisoner swap. Because once you do that, you set the conditions to give them rationale to conduct other operations to get additional prisoners. So I think it's a terrible precedent to set. But you have to understand where Jordan is right now and many of the other countries in the region. They're absolutely confused about what the U.S. position is, what the U.S. policy is, what we're trying to achieve. And we've really disappointed a lot of those people like Jordan and Bahrain, UAE. Nobody seems to know what our political goals are, and nobody seems to know what our strategy is. And I think that's because this administration at this point is adrift in a policy vacuum.
I want to get to the policy in a moment, but you just mentioned this idea of it's never a good idea to deal with terrorists. I get that because people always say that you're setting a precedent. Rick, what backs that up? Because it seems like no matter what you do, no matter what history tells us where we don't deal with the terrorists, we don't give them money, we don't give them prisoners, they still come back, they still grab people, and they still execute them. So it seems like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
There is no good solution for this. I mean, the reality is these organizations, the terrorist organizations, whether they be Sunni or Shia, they're terrorists. They hate us for who we are, and they will continue to attack us and attack Western targets. It's just a very bad idea to start to get into a tit for tat with them, because in those bargains, we are always going to lose.
With regard then to American policy, what in your opinion then is stopping all these countries in and making them take the plans that they have right now? Is it simply just for the fact that they, like everybody else, know that we don't have any real strategy against ISIS? It's got to be something more in depth than that, isn't it?
No, they all have their own challenges, and all those countries I mentioned before, to include Egypt, if you want to go over to that direction, they all have their internal radical Islamic terrorist threat that wants to undermine their authority. So to some extent, they're taking actions that are in their best interest to maintain the control of their country. What we don't have as the United States, if we're going to be the world leader, is a coherent policy and strategy for how we're going to unite all of these countries to work side by side with us and defeat this ideology that is as deadly an ideology as fascism and Nazism were in World War II.
Let's talk about some of those ideologies then, because the State Department hosted a delegation of Muslim Brotherhood-aligned leaders this week. It's a meeting about opposition to oppose the current government in Egypt. Wait a minute, Rick. The Muslim Brotherhood, as soon as you see that, we think terrorist organizations, we think Sharia law. The State Department and the U.S. government working with the Muslim Brotherhood, that's going to smack a lot of people the wrong way.
It absolutely makes no sense. We have to remember the Muslim Brotherhood spawned Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda spawned ISIS. We should have nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. There are other organizations within the United States, such as CARE, that have working relationships with the Muslim Brotherhood. We need to identify what the threat is, and thus far this administration has been unwilling to identify radical Islamic terrorists and the ideology that they come from as being the central threat to the security in this generation.
What does it tell you then about the aim of this administration when you see that they are meeting with a group like the Muslim Brotherhood? What possibly could they hope to gain?
It's unclear to me that what they want to gain. It's looking at them. It's a policy that I think is in disarray, and they're flailing, trying to figure out exactly who to deal with. Do you deal with Iran? Do you deal with the Shia groups? Is the country of Iraq our friend or our enemy at this point? what's going on in Syria. There are so many complicated issues that I think they're in a state of paralysis on how to move forward, and they're reaching out in a whole bunch of different directions. But I think it's not coherent which direction they're heading for.
All right, let's talk about a direction. About 45 seconds left. California Democrat Adam Schiff has introduced a bill that would authorize the president's war against ISIS militants. He says Congress should not wait to see if the White House sends over its blueprint of what the legislation should say. Too little, too late?
Well, first of all, we already have authorization that was given in 2002 and the previous one in 2001. Those authorizations give the president everything that he needs to do. If the Congress wanted to exert its influence and constrain presidential action, they could do what the congressman is seeking. But at this point, what he's seeking to do is to limit what the president could do at the very time when I think that we need to be more expansive and giving the president options to further unify the coalition and how they're going to attack ISIS and to some extent the Shia groups that are in the region also.
Just about FaceTime politics for a lot of people. That's the way it usually works inside the Beltway. Rick Brennan, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much for your comments.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, take care. One group of people who believe they are doing the best for their kids have rapidly become the scourge of those seeking to keep children alive and healthy. What would happen if your child got sick with the measles and died because somebody else did not inoculate their child? Ask that question. We'll do that when MidPoint continues.